And we do anticipate a full house this evening, so if you could try to leave some of the rear and aisle seats open for people who may come in towards the end, we'd appreciate that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Acton Institute. My name is Stephen Barrows, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Acton, where our mission is to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. We're delighted that you could join us for this evening's William F. Buckley Jr. 100th celebration. It is our privilege to partner with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the National Review Institute, and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal for this evening's two-panel conference examining topics through the lens of Buckley's legacy. I'd like to welcome those of you who are joining us online, and would also like to thank all of you in the auditorium for your flexibility, as the ongoing federal government shutdown entailed the closure of National Archive facilities, including the original host of this event, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. So speaking of which, I'd like to begin this evening's activities by introducing the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Gleaves Whitney. Mr. Whitney became Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation in 2020, becoming the fourth person to lead the organization dedicated to advancing the legacy of America's 38th president. During his tenure, Gleaves has expanded the capacity of the Ford to reach and teach more people than ever before. Under his supervision, the DeVos Learning Center now regularly engages elementary and secondary school students in West Michigan and beyond. Gleaves launched the Ford Leadership Forum in 2022, which now facilitates coast-to-coast programs from Washington, D.C. to Palm Desert, California. His American Conversation events showcase the impact the Ford presidency continues to have on America and the world. So please join me in welcoming Gleaves Whitney to begin our evening.
Thanks, Steve, for that very gracious introduction. And that's right, we're here because of the graciousness of the Acton Institute. Here we had this wonderful partnership that started to form many months ago, but the Acton Institute, National Review, and then, of course, you've got wonderful partners in our Ford Museum, ordinarily, that we can use. The Russell Kirk Center, a very, very close partner of ours. We all came together, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to do something which the Ford had never done before, and that is shine a spotlight on a prominent conservative like William F. Buckley, Jr. So I first want to give a shout-out to the Acton Institute for its nimbleness, because when the federal government shut down, we had to find a new venue, and Acton stepped right into the breach. And it makes me think, if you look at William F. Buckley, Jr., when he founded National Review back in 1955, so 70 years ago, remember his first words in his first editorial: "We're standing athwart history, yelling stop." Well, I don't think he anticipated 70 years later that everything would stop with the government the way it has, and we'd have to be so nimble to have a conference in his name. When we first got this assignment to have this partnership and put on the program that you're here this evening to enjoy, and it's going to be a great program. I mean, the speakers are just fantastic. When we first started planning it, of course, the first thing I did was go back to the firing lines, the original firing lines. And I found that President Ford had been on Bill Buckley's firing line several times. But interestingly, it's the firing line that he did not appear on, but that was where he was the subject of discussion, that was the most insightful. That firing line, and I would commend it to you, was from December 1975. And the interview was with Richard Reeves, who had just come out with a book, A Ford, Not a Lincoln. And Reeves was spending the first 7, 8, 9 minutes really criticizing President Ford and thinking that he had a very sympathetic ear with Buckley sitting there, because Buckley, of course, was a Goldwater conservative, a kind of a libertarian hard edge there, and then, of course, very much a Reagan conservative. And what ended up happening was the most remarkable exchange right in the middle of this, where Reeves is just attacking. Ford is vanilla. He's just the product of the system, and he's not going to do anything really to help the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And Buckley, in his inimitable way, so he got that sparkle in his eye, and he said, "Oh, I think you're wrong, Mr. Reeves. If you look at what Gerald Ford is doing, there's a historical analogy that's really important." And then Buckley pulls out an analogy that, of course, very few people would know, but historians think is a very important analogy. And that was with William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt the Younger was the British Prime Minister. Yes, you're laughing. That's exactly right. He's sitting back in his chair talking about William Pitt the Younger. And William Pitt the Younger was the Prime Minister right after Britain lost the colonies. So it was a very tumultuous time. I wish Charlie Cooke he could give a gloss on this. You'll see him later today. So Buckley said, no. He said, "I'm serious. Ford is going to prove," and he's saying this in 1975, right on the eve of the bicentennial, "Ford will prove to be a William Pitt the Younger type character for the United States and even for the world." And the analogy holds up, Buckley explained, because we were mopping up in Vietnam after a war we lost. At the same time, you look at what Pitt was trying to mop up after losing the American colonies. Britain's economic condition was in a shambles. Ford, of course, was in stagflation and trying to get the inflation rate down and the employment rate up. And then finally, on the horizon was the French Revolution and Napoleon. And Pitt negotiated that over the next 2 decades brilliantly, just as Ford negotiated in the Cold War brilliantly with Brezhnev. So Buckley's praise of the world historical significance of Gerald Ford in that segment within a segment of that firing line in December 1975, which I commend to you, was really a significant marker for me, who I go out everywhere and talk about Ford and his world historical significance. So with that little history lesson, I would like now to talk about history. I'd like to introduce somebody who's had quite a history in this town, an impact in this town. The co-founder and president of this very institution we're in, the Acton Institute, Father Robert Sirico, goes back to the 90s, late 80s and 90s. I first met you, Father, when I was working for Governor Engler, and the governor appointed you to the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. And that was a key time to be able to make arguments that cohered in defense of life and in defense of the civil rights of people who did not always get the civil rights they deserved. Father Sirico was brilliant in that commission. And I just thought to myself, I want to be around this man. I want to hear him speak more. I want to learn from him. So I will not say any more because I want to hear you speak now. And so I'm going to invite you, Father Robert Sirico, to the podium. Thank you very much.
Well, we've worked so hard to close the government, and it's finally happened. Bill Buckley would be happy. My only concern is whether or not we should take up a collection for the sustenance of Gleaves Whitney. Welcome. It's a real honor to have you all with us and to be collaborating with our intellectual cousins. This is your home. Feel free to be in our midst, and if you have any ideas of how we can collaborate more intimately, we would love to do that. I've been granted the indulgence of sharing a few memories of Bill Buckley, which I'm assured will not be deducted from my allotted time, so I've prepared a mere 25,000-word tribute, which I will read quickly. One of my most vivid memories with Bill was in 1999 in Havana, Cuba, of all places. While we had met long before that, he had given the first lecture at the Acton Institute in 1990, I think it was, and of course Russell Kirk was his introducer that night. It was when I saw him in Havana, it was during the first visit of Saint Pope John Paul II, that our paths converged. We found ourselves, interestingly enough, in the lobby of what once had been the famed gangster Meyer Lansky's hotel on the El Maricon. Bill, ever the adventurer, asked if I would like to join him in exploring the city. Would I? To wander through old Havana with the author of a novel about an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro? To sip drinks at Hemingway's old haunt, mischievously ordering Cuba Libres? To negotiate with street vendors for Cuban cigars? Remember that Bill Buckley's first language was Spanish, which he spoke in the Buckley-esque style. And then to end that day with laughter, having committed a capitalist act in one of the last bastions of socialism. Would I want to go on an exploration trip with Bill Buckley? It was an unforgettable day, etched in my memory forever. Bill was a writer who both inspired and intimidated. His eloquence would drive me to the brink of despair, in addition to the dictionary, and I wrestled with the thought that I could never, ever approach his brilliance. Reflecting on the intellectual, moral, and political chaos that we face today, I, like many of you, often wonder, what would Bill say about all of this? While it's unwise to put words in the mouths of the departed, we can certainly look to the principles that animated his thoughts and actions. Frank Meyer, who I suspect we'll hear about in due course, was one of Bill's early collaborators, and he wisely advised us to focus not on the Hydra-like problems that arise, but on the principles that address them. In 1955, when Bill penned that famous editorial for National Review's inaugural issue, he focused on the existential threat of his time, which of course was the Soviet Union. While that regime now lies on the scrap heap of history, the ideological contagion it represented still metastasizes. Neither Marx nor the Soviet Union was the root of the problem. They were merely manifestations of a much more ancient error. As Tolkien so powerfully symbolized with the Ring of Mordor, the allure of power, coercion, and domination has haunted humanity since Cain. Today we face threats just as existential, though of a different kind. These dangers cannot be defeated by military might alone, especially not when the very institutions that guard our liberty are themselves infected with the ideas that threaten it. Our era suffers from a profound confusion, a series of confusions between freedom and morality, authority and power, God and Caesar, the individual and society. And even more fundamentally, we have lost sight of what it means to be a human being. The modern heresies we face are not limited to the left. They exist on the right as well, albeit in different forms. We must confront these dangers with the same courage that Bill showed when he excommunicated the conspiracy theorists, the anti-Semites, and the cultists of his time. To both the left and the right, we must assert the reality that while humans are of the earth, we are also imbued with eternity. This transcendence binds us to protect the freedom of others, not only because it is right and just to do so, but because our own freedom is intertwined with theirs. In confronting those addicted to power, those who believe that the ends justify the means, we must not become the very thing we oppose. If victory requires us to abandon our principles, we've already lost. Instead, let us fight fire with water, for it is far more effective at extinguishing flames. Truth is a stubborn thing and outlives its obituary writers. I've often drawn strength from an essay by Friedrich Hayek from 1949, The Intellectuals and Socialism. I suspect many of you have read that. In that essay, he speculated that free societies, once established, might often carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Freedom once taken for granted might cease to be valued, especially among the young. Hayek asked whether freedom must always be lost before it is appreciated again. His answer? Perhaps, he said, though he hoped not. And then he wrote, "We must make the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage." Courage, also called fortitude, is indeed a virtue and one of the cardinal virtues. If we are to meet Hayek's challenge, we must be, first, a moral people, if we are to be a free people and defend the freedom of others. We must have the courage of our convictions and present them with clarity, consistency, and grace. Bill's life was a symphony of intellect and faith, of principle and charm, a reminder that conviction need not be dour, and that grace is not weakness, but strength under discipline. He showed us that the defense of truth requires not only courage, but joy as well. That to be serious about ideas is not to be grim about life. In an age still tempted by the idols of power and ideology, his example recalls us to something higher, something older, something truer. In the end, Bill never sought merely to win arguments, though he won many of them. He sought instead to win souls, to summon us toward fidelity to the permanent things. As he once wrote, and I quote, "If one is to be truly conservative, one must be truly devoted to something outside oneself, and older, wiser, and more enduring than one's own appetites." May we in our time be found equally devoted. Thank you very much. I'm called upon now to pass the baton. William F. Buckley, Jr. was not only a national figure, but an international one, the very embodiment of cosmopolitan conservatism. He spent his winters in Switzerland, writing and entertaining in his inimitable style, surrounded by friends who were themselves fixtures of mid-century culture, from David Niven to Roger Moore to Vladimir Nabokov and Charlie Chaplin. Among political leaders who moved in his circle were Margaret Thatcher, Henry Kissinger, and Otto von Habsburg, who I had the great pleasure of meeting in Rome when he spoke at an Acton conference a number of years ago. I remember his first words to me: "In what language shall we speak, Father?" representing his own cosmopolitan nature. Otto von Habsburg was the last crown prince of Austria-Hungary, was a statesman, an author, a champion of European unity. He built enduring friendships with many American conservatives, including our own Russell Kirk and Bill Buckley, grounded in shared convictions about freedom, faith, and the moral foundations of Western civilization. In recent years, the Otto von Habsburg Foundation in Budapest has worked diligently to preserve the Archduke's intellectual and personal legacy, processing his archives and promoting his ideas both in Hungary and abroad. Otto and Bill first met in the mid-1950s, and their acquaintance quickly deepened into a warm, enduring friendship. Otto wrote for National Review and appeared on Buckley's firing line. Their lively correspondence, full of wit and insight, offers a fascinating transatlantic dialogue on conservatism, Europe, and the moral and political challenges of their time. Yet their reflections also speak powerfully to our own moment. And so this evening we are delighted to welcome two distinguished guests from the Otto von Habsburg Foundation in Budapest. Gergely Prole is the director of the Otto von Habsburg Foundation and program director of John Lucas Institute at the University of Public Service in Hungary. And Bence Kosev is a senior research fellow at the Otto von Habsburg Foundation. I ask you now, in welcoming them for the presentation, Otto von Habsburg and William F. Buckley, Jr., A Friendship and a View from Europe. Please welcome them.
Thank you very much, Father Sirico, for your introductory words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for us to being with you and celebrate together the 100th anniversary of William Buckley. But it has a reason that we are here, and thank you very much for your argumentation and your introduction. No doubt the Western world is in a crisis, and the transatlantic relations are also in a crisis. So, and in that situation, I think it's very much important that we remember those personalities who could help us with their ideas to reflect that situation, to say something for future generation, and to encourage ourselves to do so, and to be clear about the dramatical circumstances we are living. So the task of the Otto von Habsburg Foundation is to preserve his heritage, and just I would like to give you some dates about his biography. You can see him with the last important, really influential Emperor Franz Joseph together, and with his father Charles IV as a child. And you can see him as member of the European Parliament. So you can imagine how long this procedure was, what impression he had to have to manage this change from the son of the emperor, from the last crown prince, to be as a elected parliamentarian. So while his life, 9 years, he could experience a lot of crises, but that was his deep Christian Catholic faith, which helped him to have his optimism towards the future and to help active politicians to do the right things. So the best emperor the Habsburgs never had. That was the sentence of Martin Reddy, and it's a very good sentence because his intellectual power was really exceptional. The historical personality, I mean, his background with the dynasty. The political thinker, as he studied in Belgium, in the United States. So it was a very important intellectual power. His network in the Catholic circles, in the different intellectual circles overseas, and of course the aristocratic circles he belonged to. And then the hardworking parliamentarian and an enthusiastic European, because that was, ladies and gentlemen, that time when the unification of Europe was not that what nowadays the European Union is. So that was under the banner of the subsidiarity, which is a key word, not only in the Catholic theology, in the Catholic faith, but also for the founding fathers of the European integration. So that's a short summary about the activities of our foundation. The most important part of our work is, of course, the archive. And we have, as you can see, 35,000 photographs. It's a documentary about the 20th century. It's a great experience to see that, but also, of course, also the different articles and the correspondence. And we can learn a lot from that correspondence. Also about his connections to the United States, to William Buckley, to the conservative intellectual circles in the United States. The family is still very helpful. 3 children of Otto on the picture, they help us a lot. And when the foundation was funded by the Hungarian state, when the Orban government could make that deal with the family, that was the beginning. And then today we have a well-organized archive and a very important source for our work. So, and now to the United States. And I am really touched, and that was a really moving moment when we could build up this connection with the Russell Kirk Center and also and through them with Edwin Ferner, the late Edwin Ferner, because that was for me a very moving moment when I invited him to the archive. And he could read this letter, what he wrote 1965, when I was born, to Otto von Habsburg. And initiated the first meeting with him, and that was really a beginning of a beautiful friendship. And that was a very flourishing cooperation, because as we could learn from Ed Ferner, by founding the Heritage Foundation and preparing the Reagan administration, this optimism of Otto von Habsburg, this encouraging argumentation that the Soviet Union is not able to survive. It's a bad system. So that was very important and encouraging for them. Of course, Henry Kissinger was a very interesting and important partner in the correspondence, and Bence Kochev will speak about other American personalities. We have a great book collections with dedications from Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle. The many photographs, you can see the American connections. He spent many years while the Second World War in the United States, but he visited Hollywood. You can see that on the right side. 94, before his marriage, 51. So, and the personal belongings, they are also an important part of our collections. And our duty is to organize conferences. In his sense, that's because we had the honor to greet many participants of this conference here too, and we are very honored by that. We have a special connections to the Archabbey in Pannonhalma, where his hard-earned lives. And this connection with the Catholic Church and the question of Christianity in the modern world is something which is very much in the focus of our work, and which was a very much important part of Otto Habsburg's life too. The Otto dinners with Edwin Ferner 2 years ago, but the former German, Austrian Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel is also an important part of our yearly program. And the exhibitions, you can see a small example in this room from that, and this leaflet what we have there, and please take of them. There's the content of this exhibition. We were on many places on the world. It's very important to see how the recognition for Otto von Habsburg still existent is. So we are very happy about it. And the publications we have, and this one, that's my last picture. That's a book what we made because Otto von Habsburg was an enthusiastic photographer, and in this documentation we could summarize his very rich life. So with that, happy birthday to William Buckley, and I give the floor to Bence Kochev. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also, and let me also thank you for the opportunity to be here at this this exceptional convention. So as it was mentioned, the PowerPoint just disappeared, but anyway, I can do that without that. Otto von Habsburg developed an extensive network in the United States. So he first set foot in the United States in March 1914. At that time, his country of residence, Belgium, was not at war yet with the Third Reich, to study the democracy in the United States. So Otto von Habsburg was a 20th century Alexis de Tocqueville, practically, who wanted to study more about the political conditions in the United States. He built up during the Second World War. He came back as a refugee from Europe, built up connection to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and of course with politicians from the Democratic Party, and became an integral, an important part of the Austrian and Hungarian immigrant communities in the United States, and gave lectures through tours during the Second World War and beyond here in the United States. And his main partners were, there is a terrible spelling mistake, Russell Kirk is obviously with two L's, so sorry for that. Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley from the intellectual part, and also with politicians, Barry Goldwater, David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Edwin G. Fellner. But we are today to talk about William F. Buckley. I prepared a few notes in order to keep the timeline intact and not to exploit our slot too much. So when we focus on Otto von Habsburg and William F. Buckley Jr., we are talking about two men who, coming from different milieus, shared a deep commitment, both moral and intellectual, to defend freedom in Europe and in the United States. Buckley admired the old Europe for its tradition, its history, its culture, and in this regard, Otto von Habsburg embodied the very qualities that Buckley valued in the civilization of the old continent. In his eyes, and in Dr. Kerr's eyes as well, he was a European par excellence. In turn, Otto von Habsburg recognized the sharp-minded and sharp-tongued Buckley, a kindred spirit, someone committed to the enduring ideas and clear political vision, and yet someone who could speak to a broader public. They both belonged to a generation that believed liberty was not given, but a duty, something to be argued for, defended, and lived. For Otto von Habsburg and for William Buckley, politics and public engagement were a vocation, truly in the Christian sense of the word. And I hope they, as Catholics, would forgive me the reference, but this is what Martin Luther called beruf, a calling through which one serves a higher moral order within the temporal world. Their path crossed through a remarkable intermediary, the revolutionary liberal Erich Kühnert von Ledin, a brilliant, eccentric Austrian thinker, who was also a good friend and predecessor at Chestnut Hill College of John Lukács. And as it was mentioned, over the decades, the relationship between the Archduke and William Buckley blossomed into a remarkable friendship. They met regularly both in the United States and, as it was mentioned, in Europe. William Buckley had a house in Switzerland, a refugee, where he could devote himself to write, and their correspondence ultimately filled nearly 300 pages. Otto also contributed with essay, as it was also mentioned, to the National Review and appeared 2 times at the Firing Line program of Buckley in 1969 and 1981. The latter, at least for me, is the more interesting appearance. When they were talking about European integration, early 1980s, when European integration was often seen from a US perspective as too abstract and largely irrelevant. As you may recall, Kissinger's famous bon mot, who do I call if I want to call Europe? Nevertheless, Otto used the appearance to convey his central political ideal about the European Union, namely subsidiarity. This principle, with its roots in the Catholic social thinking, emphasized the decentralization of authority and the empowerment of local institutions, and this resonated very well with Buckley's thinking. And from this perspective, and of course not only from this, but also from a broader commitment to human dignity and freedom, both Buckley and the Archduke understood that communism was not merely a geopolitical adversary, but a profound moral and spiritual threat. And this is something what we must remember on this very special day. October the 23rd is the commemorational day of the revolution of 1956 in Hungary. However, what united them was not only their opposition to communism and totalitarianism, but also a shared commitment to what they regarded as the enduring ideals of the West: human dignity, personal responsibility, and freedom as the foundation of a free society. Both Otto von Habsburg and William Buckley maintained a close friendship with Friedrich August von Hayek, and were both members of the Montpellierin Society, which dedicated itself to the renewal of classical liberal principles. American conservatives and Buckley itself admired Otto von Habsburg deeply, and the reason was captured best by his friend Russell Kirk. Dr. Kirk once wrote that Otto was better informed about the events of the time than anyone else he knew, and also possessed of a philosophical habit of a mind and a political imagination rarely matched. That combination made Otto a rare figure who was able to inspire generations of conservatives in the United States. And in turn, and at the same time, Otto admired Buckley for his ability to unite conservatives in the United States and broaden their appeal to a wider public. And from this perspective, the National Review served for Otto as an important point of reference, showing him how a principled, intellectually grounded publication could engage a broader public and help shape a political movement. And Otto admired most in Buckley that he brought not only substance but also style to the conservative Renaissance, shaping its character in the United States and far beyond. And in his last letter, and I will conclude with that, to Christopher Buckley, the son of William M. Buckley, Otto wrote, "I often think of this great American, a fighter for freedom, for decency, and for our hope in the future. And I believe we shall share this admiration for Buckley's dedication to fundamental values, and let us keep it alive as we reflect on his legacy and the enduring friendship between our two continents." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gergely and Bensei. That was an education in cosmopolitan conservatism. So that we really appreciate your time and your friendship for being here. And 300 pages of letters between Otto von Habsburg and William F. Buckley Jr. Now, surely there's some enterprising young academic here who just found themselves a great gig, a great job, some archives. That could be some kind of publication. So, all right, I'm going to encourage that. Maybe I'll take a sabbatical from the Kirk Center and do it myself. Any rate, here we are. My name is Jeff Nelson. Sorry here. I'm going to feel like William F. Buckley Jr. here now. If only I had a clipboard exactly, but at any rate. And I'm CEO of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, which is a unique academic haven of higher conservative education in an academic village just an hour north of Grand Rapids in Mecosta. For more than 30 years, the Kirk Center has hosted students, scholars, journalists who come to Russell Kirk's Mecosta to study the best of the conservative intellectual movement in America. Our 9 residential fellows and their fellows' houses, we have 9 houses, and a world-class conservative archive, although I don't think I could say world-class conservative archive after I saw your archive. Okay, we have an American class archive and library of 15,000 books, and that's been a draw for generations of visitors, including, on occasion, William F. Buckley Jr. Tonight we celebrate William F. Buckley Jr.'s centennial with this panel on education and a free society. Over the past 75 years, few subjects have preoccupied conservatives more than education. Its role in shaping character, preserving civilization, and preparing each generation for the responsibilities of freedom. Conservatives have long worried that modern education too often failed through its curricula to inculcate wisdom, virtue, and an understanding of the foundations of American freedom and constitutionalism. Instead, modern education has prized revolutionary ideologies over what Edmund Burke called the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. William F. Buckley Jr. consistently reminded us that education should be at its best a cultivation in our youth both of intellectual and moral virtue, twin pillars of a free society. From his first book, God and Man at Yale, to his lifelong engagement with universities, journalism, and debate, Buckley insisted that freedom depends upon an educated citizenry capable of defending truth against both relativism and ideological conformity. Our panel tonight features 3 individuals uniquely qualified to lead us in a discussion of Bill Buckley and education. Our first speaker, Kathryn Lopez, is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a legendary editor at National Review. We've been with us long enough, we can say you are a legendary editor. And
I
we're
have
so
the
grateful.
gray hair to
You
show
do,
it,
yeah.
Jeff.
And I have no hair, so I'm right next to you, but I'm not legendary. She will speak on education and virtue, considering how Buckley linked the cultivation of moral character to the maintenance of liberty. Next, we have George Nash, Dr. George Nash, the eminent historian of American conservatism and author of the classic history, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. He will revisit Buckley's God and Man at Yale, the provocative critique of academic orthodoxy that catapulted its author to national fame and set the stage for post-war conservative thought. Finally, Dr. Darrell Falconberg, an emerging scholar of Russell Kirk and education, will discuss Buckley's correspondence and friendship with Kirk, highlighting their shared belief that the renewal of education was essential to the renewal of civilization. He will draw especially from their alternating National Review columns. For decades, they alternated every couple of weeks with education columns. Bill's was called The Ivory Tower, and Russell Kirk's From the Academy. So you hear about both of those tonight from Darrell. Each will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for conversation. We'll go right to your questions. We don't have a lot of time tonight, so be ready. And we'll start. Kathryn? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, when you're on a panel with George Nash, you just kind of want to give them the panel and start asking George questions. But unfortunately, they're not letting us do that. So fortunately for you, George. I just want to say it's such a gift to be in Grand Rapids, although I'm a little nervous because the last time I was here for the Acton Academy, I couldn't leave. I had flights canceled for 4 days. So I may be moving in with somebody here. So prepare a room, please. I just have to say on a personal note, and I know I'm not alone on this, during the previous presentation, Ed Fulner has died. I still haven't quite processed that. What a great man. And we've had so many great men, and we still have great men and women among us. But thanks be to God for Ed, and thanks be to God for Bill Buckley. And I don't believe in coincidences. I assume I'm not alone in this crowd. And I find it remarkable that this 100th anniversary celebration, birthday celebration of William F. Buckley Jr. is happening when it's happening. That horrific murder of Charlie Kirk. It is obvious, talking about education, what was Charlie Kirk doing on college campuses? He was going, he was listening, he was being present. I'm ashamed of myself. I knew Charlie a little bit. I didn't realize how courageous and patient and kind he was. I know I'm not alone. When he was killed, I was sitting in my National Review office in New York, in fact, until about 4 a.m. watching Charlie Kirk videos. And it is remarkable, the kindness and obviously the intelligence and the rationality he brought to the table, and the faith. And I bring this up because this is a panel on education. And not only was he doing the intellectual work that maybe wasn't happening inside the classrooms on some of these campuses, but he was doing the moral and virtue foundational work that wasn't happening there. And that is what you saw. Obviously they were curious intellectually and otherwise. What was striking to me as I kept finding new videos, clicking on new videos, was, yeah, you had some kids who were obnoxious and jerks, hostile, But the majority were curious. The majority kind of wanted to know there's something like truth, that's an actual thing. I don't have to invent my truth. And you also see a lot of, and I'll bring us back to Bill in a moment. You see a lot in culture. Obviously, now that Charlie was murdered, you saw the memorial, you saw the talk of, is there some kind of revival going on, religious revival, moral revival? You've seen actually around Easter time in particular, but then Pope Francis died the next day, so it kind of killed the news cycle for investigating this more. But lots of people becoming Catholic on Easter, more people going to church in general. What is that about? And now since Charlie's murder, they're reporting Bible sales. What is that about? It's about people knowing. All right, we long, but they know there's got to be something more. Whether that's God or whatever it is, they're open to something more. And one of the things I was always struck by with Bill Buckley, and I'm not telling everybody to go out and write for Playboy or whatever the equivalent is in 2025, but Pope Francis, who of course was a favorite among conservatives, God bless him, he talked a lot about going to the peripheries. And sometimes the peripheries is right in front of you, but you're looking at your phone. I'm sorry, this is I'm talking about myself. I'm looking at my phone too much to notice what's going on in front of me. But sometimes it's, there is that joke everyone knows about Bill Buckley doing the Playboy interview because he wanted to reach his son, Christopher, right? But the fact of the matter is, so Bill Buckley gives Hugh Hefner a platform on Firing Line. Okay. He starts Firing Line by saying, hello, Hugh Hefner. You and Playboy philosophy are destroying civilization and the human family in particular, which of course will destroy civilization. Then, in turn, so yeah, he gives Hugh Hefner a platform, but on Bill Buckley's terms. In return, Hugh Hefner says, write for Playboy sometime. What does Bill do? He writes about virtue for Playboy. He writes about charity for Playboy. Stuff that I assume you normally don't see in Playboy. And I do think that's instructive. And it goes back to Charlie Kirk, and it goes back to what is deeper and the longer term connection that people need to get at this moment, especially young people who are thirsting. It's one thing to right now, go on campus and, so-called replace Charlie Kirk, which can't happen, right? But have the glitzy events, right? But there's something deeper, something much more, and that's what Bill Buckley was always about. And it didn't start with him, and that's the remarkable thing about Bill, right? I always say, we're the ones we have been waiting for. That Barack Obama campaign slogan was so perfect because it's our bipartisan problem. We think, oh, wow, I'm here. Everyone, listen to me. I got the greatest plan. No. There are so many who came before us, the patrimony, and we are called to be good stewards. I think I've taken up my, so I won't, but there was a column, one column in particular in the early 60s that was republished in the Jeweler's Eye, which you can Google and read, so I'm not going to read it to you. But it was on the Playboy philosophy. And Bill's point was, and this is I know my colleague Charlie Kirk makes another point about every time there's a school shooting or something, right? Everyone wants to ban the perfect gun that will end all of school shootings or shootings in general. I come to you as a survivor of a mall shooting. That's a whole other story. But my point is that we're not going to make a law that's going to ban every school shooting. We're not going to make a law that is going to make sure that people get married and have children. And we need laws, but underlying those laws, we need mores. We need people who want to be virtuous, who know that what virtue is, who know that that is actually the better way and actually the way to joy and happiness and stuff that we want. And we need to be there for them. And that's why it's so great that your Russell Kirk Center, the Acton Institute, the National Review Institute, National Review. These institutions exist. They're not relics. They're actually, we have as our patrimony, we are stewards of what people want. And so thank you, everyone who supports the work that we try to do. And I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. Kathryn and George, you want to pick up the baton?
Is this working for you all? Okay, fine. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be in your company tonight and to be on this platform with my friend Kathryn, Darrell, and Jeff. My subject is the first book that William F. Buckley Jr. ever wrote. For students of faith, freedom, and the role of education in American society, it is a book that remains worth reading. Buckley was born in 1925 into a conservative Roman Catholic family. As a student at Yale University from 1946 to 1950, he grew distressed by the pedagogical drift of things around him. Brought up to be a devout Christian and staunch individualist, in today's parlance a classical liberal or libertarian, he was appalled by the secularism, atheism, and socialistic sentiments that he encountered inside and outside the classroom, and by official Yale's seeming indifference to these trends. Shortly after graduating, he embarked upon a critical study of this subject, which, when published in 1951, bore the provocative title, God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of, quotation marks, Academic Freedom. In his foreword, Buckley asserted that, and I quote, "The duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. I further believe that the struggle between individualism and collectivism is the same struggle reproduced on another level." Alas, he reported, neither Orthodox Christianity nor traditional American beliefs in free enterprise were receiving much support in Yale's classrooms. Instead, this campus was suffused with secularist biases and dominated in the field of economics by professors who favored what he called a revolution. In his words, Buckley's words, one that advocates a slow but relentless transfer of power from the individual to the state. To halt Yale's slide toward the left, Buckley audaciously called upon his fellow alumni to interfere, his word, and set Yale's educational policy aright. Invoking a consumer sovereignty model for university governance, he argued that the university's alumni, its consumers, were the ultimate governing body and ultimate overseers of Yale's product, and should insist that their alma mater instill the value orthodoxy, his words, that they believed in. The educational institutions of the West were the nerve center of civilization, he contended, and he said its academic guardians, and he put those words in quotes, must not be allowed to hide behind what he called the hoax of academic freedom. God and Men at Yale quickly became a bestseller. Interest in his broadside was partly stimulated by its sheer novelty and effrontery. Buckley expected his volume to evoke bitter opposition. What he did not foresee was the incredible torrent of vituperation that soon rained down upon him. Instead of loftily ignoring Buckley's polemic, official Yale reacted to it in one journalist's words, with all the grace and agility of an elephant cornered by a mouse. On campus and in prominent liberal magazines, he was denounced by Yale professors and others as a bigot, a barbarian, and an advocate of pure fascism. He was compared to Torquemada, the leader of the Spanish Inquisition, and to Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda. Why was Yale's reaction to God and men at Yale, in Buckley's later words, so remarkably virulent? In the case of Yale's administration, the immediate motivation was fear of a severe financial backlash from its alumni. Yale's liberal professors and leftist professors elsewhere feared something else, a loss of academic power and, conceivably, employment, if Buckley's challenge to academic freedom and his theory of alumni sovereignty bore fruit. Some of Buckley's fiercest critics also took aim at what they considered the key to the entire controversy, his ardent Roman Catholicism. To the liberal Protestant custodians of Yale's self-understanding, Buckley's shocking appeal for a new value orthodoxy looked like nothing less than an attempt to impose a retrograde, quote, Catholic, unquote, model of education upon historically Protestant Yale. Rather ironically, Buckley found himself under attack from Roman Catholics as well. Not for his strictures on secularism in education, but for his pro-capitalist economic individualism. Liberal Catholic commentators and journals vociferously claimed that his laissez-faire economic philosophy flagrantly contravened the social teachings of his church. Buckley fought back hard against his critics. Both then and later, he insisted that the teaching part of a college should be animated by certain values, and that the alumni should, in his words, have the final voice on the values that a college seeks to promote and cherish. Eventually, the brouhaha over God and men at Yale subsided. And when it did, it became clear that, contrary to Yale's panicky fears, its alumni had failed to rise up, withdraw financial support, and then reform their alma mater on Buckleyite lines. This exposed a serious chink in Buckley's armor. What if the alumni were too lethargic or befuddled to be reliable reformers? Even worse, what if, over time, a majority of the graduates of Yale and other elite universities turned out to be not Christian conservatives, but secular progressives satisfied with the campus status quo? For Buckley himself, the battle over his book had two beneficial consequences. First, with a powerful but inadvertent assist from Yale's wrathful apologists, a conservative superstar was born. The controversy made him famous and catapulted him to the forefront of the emerging conservative intellectual and journalistic community, where he happily remained for more than half a century. Second, God and Men at Yale introduced a permanently populist dimension into American conservatives' critique of academe. American conservatives before Buckley and after him had many criticisms, but it was Buckley who first argued that the problem in American higher education inhered in a power structure controlled by a self-serving elite, preaching freedom but practicing a near monopoly, preaching tolerance but too often willing to marginalize conservative dissenters. The traumatic God and Man at Yale controversy gave him, and many who followed him, a lifelong distrust of what they regarded as an arrogant liberal establishment. Today, nearly 75 years after its publication, God and Man at Yale continues to be read. It lives on, I think, because its courageous author raised permanent questions concerning faith, freedom, and education that continue to roil American life. When all is said and done, what is the purpose of a college or university? Who should define and oversee the fulfillment of its goals? Perhaps the final lesson of God and Man at Yale is this. Just as it has been said that war is too important to be left to the generals, so is education too serious an enterprise to entrust to any single unaccountable authority. Thank you.
Okay, well done. First two panelists, we're right on schedule. You got to, keep it up. Don't let us down, Darrell.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the Acton Institute and for Ford. It's really a privilege to be on the panel. There's little doubt that William F. Buckley, born 100 years ago this November, was one of the most important writers and public figures of the 20th century. In fact, no intellectual history of the post-war conservative Renaissance would be complete without giving due recognition to Buckley's achievements. When Buckley emerged onto the national scene in the early 1950s, it was often believed that there was no conservative tradition in America. There was only one tradition in the United States, the argument went, and that was the liberal tradition. In 1950, the literary critic Lionel Trilling had even said, quote, "It is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. The conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and some ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas." This perception changed, however, shortly after Trilling wrote those lines. In 1953, Russell Kirk, the historian and man of letters who lived most of his adult life nearby in Mecosta, Michigan, published his landmark book, The Conservative Mind. This fat book, as he called it, was an intellectual history of conservative thought from Edmund Burke to T.S. Eliot. It helped to define and provide a lineage for conservatism, and in doing so, it catalyzed a post-war conservative revival. Throughout this book and others, Kirk demonstrated that conservatism was an intellectually viable American tradition. Buckley, himself influenced by the conservative mind, then built on Kirk's achievement by reconfiguring conservatism into a popular movement, using his magazine, National Review, to unite traditionalists, libertarians, and anti-communists into a coalition, and to bring the ideas of this coalition into a general readership. Beyond their role in helping to revive conservative thought after the war, Buckley and Kirk shared another common ground, one that lay at the heart of their cultural vision. Both were committed to the renewal of liberal arts education. As we've just heard, God and Man at Yale propelled Buckley into the national spotlight as one of the leading conservatives of the post-war era. Although Buckley was young when he wrote it, God and Man at Yale was more than a spirited polemic. It was also a reflection on the purpose of higher education and a diagnosis, in his view, of what had gone wrong. Buckley, a fervent Catholic, argued that the modern university had lost touch with the moral and religious foundations that animated Western civilization. He claimed that Yale, and by extension, much of American higher education, had abandoned its commitment to Christianity and to freedom, replacing them instead with secularism and economic collectivism. By 1953, Russell Kirk had emerged as one of America's most thoughtful scholars and men of letters. The conservative mind, again, had established him as a leading historian of ideas, while books such as A Program for Conservatives and Academic Freedom extended his humane conservatism into the realm of education. Recognizing a shared concern for the moral and educational dimensions of culture, Buckley sought out Kirk to write for National Review. And so he traveled to Mecosta to seek Kirk's help. Buckley later recalled that he was nervous, for at only 28 years old, he felt that a large gulf lay between Kirk, an accomplished scholar, and himself. But he quickly found Kirk to be warm and friendly, and after an extended evening of conversation and many Tom Collinses, Kirk agreed to write a column for National Review on higher education in America. Kirk's column from the Academy would become a fixture in National Review. And the meeting between these two men in Mecosta created a partnership that would shape the course of the conservative revival and the future of American education. Kirk's column would stand in parallel to Buckley's own educational column, which was called the Ivory Tower. The two men were certainly at odds on the topic of academic freedom, and they certainly did not agree on all matters. Yet Buckley discerned an important common ground between the two of them. Writing to Kirk, he said, "You will be saying important things and saying them well. Your comments will fully round out our very important program to provide an intimate and probing coverage of the important doings in the academic world." Buckley's alliance with Kirk was important for several reasons. For one, it led to the University Bookman, a bulletin edited by Kirk and distributed to National Review subscribers that sought to restore and elevate educational standards in America. Buckley later helped to found the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and in time the Philadelphia Society, both of which played vital roles in cultivating intellectual life parallel to the Academy. Kirk, for his part, was active in both organizations and celebrated both in his own column. Kirk's column also reminded readers that education is about more than credentials. It is about the transmission of what he called the permanent things. His column defended the conviction that schools and universities must preserve and pass on the moral and cultural inheritance that sustains a free society. Buckley then complemented this effort through his own column, The Ivory Tower, where he continued the critique we have just heard that he advocated first in God and Man at Yale. Though their voices were distinct, both men held that a free and humane society depends on recovering the true and traditional purpose of education. Buckley recognized the significance of their shared work, joking in another letter that Kirk's educational column was, quote, one of the two great successes of the magazine. The other success, he implied, was of course his own. Kirk's column, written for Buckley's magazine, helped the growing conservative community to understand how American education was to be renewed. He brought national attention to Thomas Aquinas College and John Senior's Integrated Humanities Program, as well as other emerging liberal arts institutions. In some instances, he helped colleges and programs such as these find their earliest students. Through his good emphasis on good books and the moral imagination, Kirk anticipated many of the ideas that now shape the classical education movement, a movement which really bears the influence of both Kirk and Buckley in very significant ways. Both men, furthermore, were early commentators on issues of educational freedom and academic standards, and their thinking anticipated aspects of the later school voucher and choice movement. Indeed, Buckley's new magazine became a prominent voice for the conviction that a genuinely liberal education is pursued for wisdom and virtue, and that it transmits a cultural inheritance. Today, Buckley is rightly remembered as a seminal figure in the post-war conservative revival. Yet his legacy reaches beyond politics and into education, where his writing and efforts helped to revive interest in liberal learning amid the growing dominance of ideological and utilitarian models of schooling. On this centenary of Buckley's birth, the younger generation should remember these great achievements. Yet we must admit that too few of them, unfortunately, know who Buckley was. His wit, erudition, achievements, and courage in defending the life of the liberally educated mind should not be allowed to fade from our cultural memory. And so it falls to us here today to make sure that Buckley and other fathers of the post-war conservative revival are not forgotten.
Well done. Thank you, Darrell. I didn't mention that Darrell is the academic program officer at the Russell Kirk Center, and you can now see why we're so excited to hire him. That was great, Darrell. Thank you. All right. Well, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. We got about roughly 15 minutes. So if you have some questions, we'll start them off. If you don't, we'll talk. But we want you to engage. Go ahead. We got first question here. Don't be bashful. 2. All right. Is that Senator Albert back there?
Yes.
Oh, good. I can't see on the lights, but I always recognize you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the comments on this panel. I guess my first question would be. Sorry, I guess I'll stand up. You're looking around.
There are lights right above you,
okay.
so that's why we're looking at you strangely.
I guess my first question would be, would Buckley and Kirk have agreed on a definition of academic freedom? I read God, Man at Yale. It's been a year, but I know one of the arguments that Buckley made was that academic freedom doesn't necessarily mean to do and teach whatever you want. You need to kind of seek some type of truth into what you're teaching. When I look at what's going on in our higher ed institutions today, I think it's manifested even more. So would they have put any type of limits and definition of academic freedom?
They did not agree completely on academic freedom, and I would defer to Darrell for more on that. In fact, there was Buckley wrote a review of one of Kirk's books, and it was quite critical in 1955. And I read that, and I thought, how did Kirk then agree to join Buckley? Because they did have that difference. And Kirk, in print, in a respectful way, dissociated himself from Buckley's consumer theory, sovereignty theory, and I perhaps let have you say more if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean that all. I would agree with all of that. And I would also say at the same time, though, that I think that Kirk's understanding of academic freedom is not quite the understanding of academic freedom that Buckley was critiquing. Because Buckley is critiquing the kind of, I guess you might say the Millian kind of Enlightenment understanding of academic freedom, that the best ideas always win, that in the marketplace of ideas, that kind of thinking. Kirk understood academic freedom as a classical and Christian concept, something that went back to Socrates and to the schoolmen. So it was a very traditionalist understanding of the freedom, and I think there was a sense in which Buckley would have agreed with a certain understanding of academic freedom if it is defined in a particular way. And Kirk also would place limits on academic freedom in certain contexts. He didn't believe it was an abstract right. So there's also some overlap between the two, in addition to their disagreements.
Just reminded me of something. I think Buckley made a distinction between the research function of a university and the teaching function. And he felt that the teaching function should be what we would call conservative, transmitting the values about the good, the true, the beautiful, the values of Western civilization. He was not opposed to independent, free academic research, but he said that that's not the same thing as what a college should be attempting to do. Would that be, you'd agree with that?
I also want to add that one thing that it doesn't surprise me he would have Kirk, even though they had disagreements, because the one thing Bill loved, one of the things Bill loved was debate. And so it more exhilarated him to have people around who would give him a hard time about something or create a challenge. And, he didn't like debate for debate's sake, but part of the reason, and Stephanie has made herself the fusionist czar at this point. She's the expert. But one of the reasons he was so good at uniting and writing people out when they needed to be written out is because he appreciated we need to have debates and stimulating conversations even amongst ourselves. There had to be some debate going on. And just on academic freedom and just listening to the wonderful comments on God and Man and Yale and all, I was at the postage stamp unveiling at Yale, and it was really remarkable. First of all, I was really heartened to see how many young people came, how many students came. I was also heartened to see, even just walking around campus, going to the bookstore, the number of people who knew it was going on, knew who Bill Buckley was just it was really it was encouraging, and I can't imagine what Bill Buckley would think about the fact that there's a postage stamp with his face on it. It is a beautiful thing, though.
Only to say, I think it was answered. It was a question about academic freedom, how they viewed the difference. And George, thank you for that comment about Dr. Kirk. I never knew that freedom, academic freedom, the pursuit and research versus a practitioner. That's a very interesting comment. So then my question now would be, could you say a little more on that?
That was a distinction Buckley made in God and Man at Yale eventually. Buckley made so, but Buckley really drew the line hard, I thought, upon rereading the book and so forth for this event. And he drew the line that the function of a college is to transmit revealed knowledge and, as Darrell said, lead people toward virtuous lives, and that is religiously oriented. So he wanted, in a sense, a confessional college. Now, he disliked what he called the what was the term? Just the theory that anything goes. You could just take a bunch of courses, get credits, and graduate. So he really wanted a more organized form of instruction. Now, that was derided by some of his liberal Protestant opponents who thought that what he was trying to do was indoctrinate. That was a bad term for them, you see. He's indoctrinating. So, and one of them said very snidely, well, Buckley should have gone to Fordham. And so forth. So I would leave it to Darrell to elaborate, if he wants, on Kirk's theories. But there was that clash between them initially, which was kind of sharp on Buckley's part. Kirk wrote a book called On Academic Freedom, didn't he? Yes. And Buckley reviewed it, I've forgotten where, I think maybe in the Freeman, in about 1955. At the time, Buckley was urging Kirk to join the National Review enterprise. And Buckley did not think it was made the proper distinctions. It was just too murky for Buckley's taste, and Kirk then, in turn, as I indicated earlier, in one of his books about that, published the same year, said that the true scholar is the bearer of the word, capital W, and those people deserved academic freedom. So Kirk did not share Buckley's viewpoint about how you should organize a university. I may be oversimplifying a bit here, but they certainly had a lot in common, as was indicated earlier by my colleague here.
I think when Buckley was a student at Yale, or when Kirk was a professor at MSU, most of their classmates, most of their students, of course, the majority would have been young men. That situation is now, of course, reversed. It's mostly women outnumber young men in the university. I'm curious, because I think many have commented on this, that higher education is actually driving a wedge between young men and young women. And if Buckley was a student now and on a college campus, would God and Man at Yale have something to do with how the ideologically driven education is actually separating young men and women, causing both a rift between them? And if that's true, how ought conservatives to think about that dynamic, and what, if anything, is there to do as it relates to higher education?
Do you have thoughts on that?
I think, part of Bill's critique and part of Bill's leadership in general was cultural, and so he honed on that immediately. I think that part of what you're seeing right now with young people's attraction, and young men, frankly, attraction to things conservative and to conservative male writers in a particular way and speakers is trying to find their way through this, and appreciating that there's something, appreciating that you can tell the difference between what a woman is and what a man is, and not to joke about it, but they know that there is something that is right. And they know that there's an intellectual tradition besides the biological facts that have everything to do with that. And I think that they would have naturally been drawn to wherever Bill was leading. And I think it would be, although it's a different time, one of the things Bill always talked about is like, you don't change the Beatitudes, but you need to figure out a different way to communicate them to a different crowd. And whatever God and Man in Yale would look like today, it'd be something similar, but a different way of communicating.
Darrell, I have a question. I don't have a mic, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
My own mic, thanks. I'm back. Yeah,
we weren't going to give it back to you, John.
No, I know. I was not going to hold it now with two hands. Listening to Amy and talking about the rise of the research institutions and the concern with that, Darrell and George, maybe you could say a couple of words at least about Russell Kirk, and I'm not sure what Buckley says exactly about this. The whole question of the scale of higher education, the growth of what Russell Kirk called the behemoth university in the 50s, the lack of any serious education that could go on, and institutions of 30,000, 40,000 people and football games and everything else. And he had some pretty trenchant and tough thoughts about the connection of that and academic freedom and educational renewal. And so I think this whole question of the scale of education being so disfigured was a big important to Kirk's notion, and I wonder if you talk about it, because he talked about it a lot, and I wonder where we're at with that today. Obviously, if there's any way back, or what Bill Buckley said, I'm not sure, but just any thoughts on the problem of scale in education?
Yeah, and it relates also to the topic of academic freedom, too. I mean, because Kirk's understanding of academic freedom was that it was a precondition on which the life of the mind can be lived, that you have to have a certain amount of freedom given to scholars so that they can pursue the truth, so that they can advance the truth. And in the aftermath of World War II, Dr. Kirk vehemently opposed the massive expansion of the scale of higher education. And he thought that Michigan State College, then called Michigan State College, was kind of a symbol of what he called a behemoth university. And the massive expansion of education and the consequent lowering of academic standards was threatening to academic freedom, and it was something that he thought was very detrimental to higher education, because there has to be a certain human quality to education. There has to be a community of learners, a community of scholars, and when a professor is unfortunately made to teach, Kirk talked in the sort of imagination about as many as 100 students in a classroom, it's impossible to form that kind of community of scholars that characterizes
education on a human scale.
Yes.
Sounds impossible. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I don't have a sense that Buckley thought about that angle so much. He was concerned about the ideological indoctrination that he had witnessed, and I think he was right about it, actually, at Yale. The Keynesian revolution was just making its way into the textbooks in the late 40s, and he also had critiques about the rather flaccid Christianity that was being expressed at Yale, and just pro forma in his view. It should be brought up perhaps in this context that Buckley lectured all over the place at many universities. I don't recall that he spoke about the university as the multiversity or critical of it in the sense of its great corporate or bureaucratic structure, but more about those particular items of instruction. Incidentally, he was very fond of Hillsdale College and gave a collection of his published writings to Hillsdale, and I believe that's accessible online. So he had a connection with that particular small college. So those will be just a few additional comments to offer. But Buckley never abandoned, I don't believe he ever abandoned that fundamental claim that he made, that the people who should control the destiny of the institution it's not so much a matter of size, it's a matter of the alumni directing the values. He said, if you don't believe the values of what Yale is teaching, he said that in the book, he said, you should not contribute financially to it. He says it right there toward the end of the book. Of course, that caused apoplexy. You have to remember, the book came out at the very week that Yale celebrated its 250th anniversary. And Buckley saw to it, and his father helped pay Henry Regnery enough money to expedite the publication so that it would come out at the same time and get in on that national publicity. This is a big thing. Time magazine and others wrote about it, and Buckley was the dissenter, and Time called him a rebel in reverse. And so, but that's the critique of Buckley, I think, is rather different in its focus, although I think he would agree with Kirk on a lot of things. But I don't sense that he was worried about the scale of instruction in quite the way Dr. Kirk was.
And George, you made the point, he obviously lectured so often on college campuses. And I just think Bill saw universities as such an opportunity for human encounter, and obviously that they could do a lot of damage too. But I remember when he died, the tremendous amount of testimonies people gave about the one conversation they had with Bill Buckley, the one encounter. It was when he came to my college campus and I drove him from the airport or something like that. He really did see it as an opportunity to encounter young people.
All right, to close, I was wondering if I get some thought to you. Are there any aspects of higher education today that if Buckley were alive that would, not counting Hillsdale College, all right, let's start, no Hillsdale College. Are there any aspects of higher education that would delight him today on today's college campus frontier? Not Hillsdale College. We love Hillsdale, but something else.
I suspect, you're looking at me, I guess I'll start. I suspect that he would speak very approvingly of the homeschool movement, Christian classical schools, that kind of focused education on the great books and learning and
as a feeder into higher education.
Sorry,
that's so secondary education. I was thinking higher education.
Oh well, higher education. Again, the classical or the orientation of certain colleges, like St. John's, I'm supposing here that would appeal to him.
Got it. Any thoughts, Joe? You're the Renewal guy.
I would agree. I think both of them would look very favorably on the current classical education movement, in particular. A lot of the people who are kind of leading the institutions in the classical education movement grew up reading National Review, and a lot of them very openly claim both Buckley and Kirk as influences on their educational philosophy. So it's I think very concretely you see in the classical education movement this kind of influence. One of the books that helped to kind of catalyze the classical education movement was called Climbing Parnassus, which was written by
Tracy Lee Simmons, yeah.
Yeah, by Tracy Lee
National
Simmons. Yeah. So there's a real concrete connection there between the post-war conservative intellectual movement and the current classical education movement. Some institutions that they both might like, maybe St. Thomas More College. In the correspondences, Buckley and Kirk do discuss colleges amongst themselves that they both like. That comes to mind as well.
You mentioned Thomas Aquinas too, so that yeah. Good.
I just want to say about Thomas Aquinas, I know we've had in recent years at least one graduate from there, and he would have loved that they learned Thomas Aquinas in Latin. But the other thing that I think, and playing the what would Bill Buckley think game is always dangerous, but I think one thing, Hillsdale is an example of this. Franciscan University of Steubenville is another example of this, to stay in the general region, I guess.
Grove City?
Grove City is an example. Yes, it is. I think he would have been really interested in the cultural conservatism, and in particular, the kids getting married young and the young families on campus. I think he would have been he would have found appealing.
Like Shakespeare, we're going to end with a good marriage, and and we'll transition from National Review in Education to National Review in Politics, I think. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll look forward to the next panel.
Thank you, Jeff.
If you'd migrate back into the auditorium and get seated, we're going to start here in about 2 minutes.
Your seats. We're going to start the second panel and the final panel of this evening. This crowd is quieter when there's food, I've noticed. That's good. I'm John Pinheiro, Director of Research at Acton Institute. Welcome. I believe I probably had the shortest commute of anyone on my panel this evening. I walked from upstairs a few hours ago. This panel is entitled Fusionism, Old and New. And before I introduce the panel, I want to say how much I enjoyed the first panel, particularly hearing about God and man at Yale. It reminded me of some mission work I did at a college for almost 2 decades, where I was compared to Savonarola, to which I said, "Oh shucks," but I was never compared to Torquemada, so I feel like now I didn't work hard enough. But here I am. Now, William F. Buckley complained that he had, quote, never failed to dissatisfy an audience that asked him the meaning of conservatism. He particularly disliked being asked to give a one-sentence definition of conservatism. He would respond that, quote, I cannot give you a definition of Christianity in one sentence, but that does not mean that Christianity is undefinable, end quote. And yet this panel will continue this adventure in definition by attempting to define fusionism, the term often applied to the 20th century American conservative movement that united anti-communists, free market libertarians, and social conservatives in common cause. According to Lee Edwards, Buckley had a special genius as a fusionist that enabled him to keep writers like Russell Kirk, Richard Weaver, Frank Chodorov, James Burnham, Wilmore Kendall, and Frank Meyer all on the same masthead at National Review for so many years. Buckley, Edwards writes, showed, quote, extraordinary skill at honoring and integrating the conflicting voices on the conservative choir, end quote. Well, the choir is not as in unison as it once was, if it ever was. Old alliances have frayed and new ones have emerged. This panel is intended to ask what the old fusionism actually was, whether there really is a new fusionism, and indeed to question whether there is a better description of fusionism than that of a dissonant coalition in need of a choir master to bring it into harmony. Speaking first will be Stephanie Slade, talking about what fusionism isn't. Stephanie Slade is a senior editor at Reason Magazine, where she covers the intersection of religion and politics, and a fellow in liberal studies here at the Acton Institute. Beyond Reason, her writing has appeared in America Magazine, the New York Times, and elsewhere. She is currently working on a book on fusionism. Nathan Schlueter will be speaking on William F. Buckley, Soul Fusionist. That's soul with an S-O-U-L. Nathan is professor of philosophy at Hillsdale College. He is the author or editor of 3 books, and his articles have appeared in First Things, Touchstone, Logos, Communio, Public Discourse, and Perspectives in Political Science. He is a recipient of Hillsdale College's Doherty Award for Teaching Excellence and the teacher of the popular online Hillsdale course, Introduction to Western Philosophy. And he was recently awarded Heritage Foundation's Freedom and Opportunity Academic Prize for his contributions to conservative thought and ideas. And the final speaker on our panel tonight will be Charlie Cooke. Charlie is a senior editor at National Review and the former editor of National Review Online. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, at which he studied modern history and politics. His work is focused especially on Anglo-American history, British liberty, free speech, the Second Amendment, and American exceptionalism. He is the co-host of the Mad Dogs and Englishmen podcast and is a regular guest on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. He has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Stephanie, you're up.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Okay.
Pretty cool.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I titled my talk "What Fusionism Isn't," because I consider my job to be basically debunking the way that most people, and probably many people in the room, and I suspect even maybe most of the people on this panel, understand the word fusionism, the concept of fusionism in the context of, the American conservative movement. So out in the real world, you use the word fusionism and people think you're talking about fusion cuisine that brings together different cultures, or maybe some sort of like atomic fusion energy, right? In the conservative movement, often I notice, and I have a Google News alert set up, so anytime the word fusionism is in an article, I get an email alert about it, and I find the way that it's most often used is as a synonym for what is sometimes also referred to as Reagan's three-legged stool. The three-legged stool of economic libertarians, of religious traditionalists or social conservatives, and of Cold War hawks, military hawks, anti-communists, who came together in the 1980s and came together to elect Ronald Reagan. And they were sort of united by, they maybe had different priorities or different top values, right? You had the libertarians who cared about individual liberty. You have the conservatives who care about individual virtue, promoting and cultivating virtue. But they all were anti-communist because the Soviet Union was sort of the enemy to all these things, right? It was militantly atheist and it was militantly anti-capitalist. So everybody can come together and support a president who wants to help take down the Soviet Union. So you get this three-legged stool of these different constituencies who have a shared enemy, and so they can all vote for the same guy, Ronald Reagan, for president. And that's fusionism. It's a fusion of these different, it's a coalition, right? It's an alliance. That's the way this word is often, most often I find used. And I want to argue that that is a totally ahistorical and incorrect understanding. Sorry, Charlie, I think you're going to disagree with me on this. The word was coined much earlier, in the late 60s, early 1970s, to describe the idea that what it meant to be a conservative in the American context, as opposed to, say, Europe, a conservative in America cares about both liberty and virtue. That this fusion of liberty and virtue is the thing that we want to conserve if you're a conservative in America. That the Judeo-Christian moral tradition that prioritizes virtue and the classically liberal political tradition that prioritizes liberty came together in a unique way at the American founding, that the American founders cared about both these things. And if you think about that famous quote from John Adams, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. Here you have these things coming together. We need, if we want to have a free society with limited government, we also need to have a virtuous people who have self-control and self-discipline and are self-governing. So you need virtue in order to have liberty, in order for that to be sustainable, and vice versa. You need liberty in order to cultivate virtue. If you can't make choices, people can't make choices for themselves. If you don't have a free society, if you have the Soviet Union or some sort of other form of totalitarianism, you're not going to get virtue because people aren't learning to exercise those moral muscles and make choices for themselves. So this idea that liberty and virtue are mutually reinforcing and we need to care about both of them, and they're both non-negotiable, and they're both necessary to human flourishing, that's what Fusionism was referring to. It was this philosophical synthesis, not just a bunch of different groups with different priorities who were coming together and agreeing to play nice temporarily in order to get something they wanted politically in the short term. It was, if you're a libertarian and you care about liberty, you also need to care about virtue. And if you're a traditionalist, a social conservative who cares about virtue, you also need to care about liberty. We need to defend them both. We can't just have one or the other. Okay? So it's not an alliance. It's not a coalition. It's not just a momentary, fleeting, convenient thing that we put together. It's not a stool. It's a philosophical synthesis. That was the idea that the word fusionism was coined to capture. And awkwardly for me, given the purpose of tonight's event, Bill Buckley was not really much of a fusionist in this way. The person most closely associated with this kind of fusionism, philosophical fusionism that I'm describing, was not Bill Buckley, it was Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was another senior editor at National Review in those early days. He's the one that wrote these ideas about the American founding and about the coming together of these two traditions and the fusion of them. And it was his writing that the word fusionism was coined to describe. Buckley, again, awkwardly for me right now, was much more focused on the coalitional side of things. He was a movement builder. He was a coalition builder. He went out of his way to find prominent representatives of all these different factions on the right and to make a point of bringing them together under one tent and giving them places within his magazine because he wanted to build a movement, a conservative movement that would be politically successful, and he knew that that's what it took. But he was not very much of a consistent ideologue in my reading, I would argue. I read the recent Santana House biography, and I was going to write something for Reason Magazine where I work about Buckley and whether he was or wasn't a libertarian. That was my assignment. And it's like, well, okay, Bill Buckley, was he an isolationist or a military non-interventionist who thought that America should not go get involved in other people's foreign wars? Or was he a military hawk who wanted to pour lots of money into a military buildup and have an active presence abroad? Anybody know? He was both, right, at different times in his life. Was he a tough-on-crime conservative who defended the death penalty? Or was he a civil libertarian who thought we should legalize drugs and gambling? He was both, right? He's not really an ideologue in the same way. So somebody who had a consistent political program and built on a clear philosophy that transcended time. He was much more of a person who just wanted to bring different people together, and it was okay if we disagree. And we can sit around and we can have that disagreement, and we can have that debate, but if we share enough of the same values, we can support the same person, we can get across the finish line politically. That was Buckley. Frank Meyer was the guy who wanted to really lay out a philosophy. He wanted to talk about what is the proper role of the state. The state should do these things. It should not do these things. These things should be in the realm of the virtue should be the thing that we prioritize in the non-governmental sphere of life. Liberty should be the thing we prioritize in the governmental sphere of life. He was trying to build a sort of rigorous philosophy that came to be known as fusionism, and it was very influential to the conservative movement. And so I think that there's a lot of value and a lot of truth in that philosophy. And one of the things I try to do in my work is I'm trying to resurrect that philosophical fusionism that gives us kind of clearer answers about what is the proper role of state in society. When should government get involved and when shouldn't it? And under what conditions and in what ways is it proper for government to be involved in things versus letting us in the non-governmental sphere of life, in the civil society part of life, in our private lives, try to solve problems. That philosophy, I think, is really important. Again, I'm trying to revive it. I don't think Bill Buckley is the best proponent of that, unfortunately, but he did something also very valuable, which is he built the conservative movement as we know it, and his flexibility and his willingness to share a stage with people whether he agreed or disagreed, which is something that Frank Meyer would do, but Meyer was a little bit more cantankerous about being with people who didn't share his philosophical beliefs. That was Buckley's contribution to the movement. Less fusionism, I think, and more coalition building. And I just want to keep that distinction between those two things clear, because as valuable as coalition building is, and is obviously necessary to political success, if you want to be successful in politics, you have to get to 50+1, as Buckley used to say, right? Get across the finish line to win an election, to actually implement your ideas. That if you don't know what your principles are, the first principles that your movement is sort of founded on, then you're just winning elections for the sake of winning elections, for the sake of acquiring power to do what with it. Then what Frank Meyer kind of offered to the conversation was, if you don't get those first principles right, then what's the point of winning elections? We have to get the philosophy right first, and I think that's correct. And I do think we've somewhat lost sight of that in our politics today.
Thank you very much. Nathan?
Okay, first I want to say what an honor it is to be here up on this stage. Talk about feeling like a dwarf on the shoulder of giants, to be someone speaking kind of in the presence of these great figures that we're talking about here today. Father Sirico, thank you for that very moving tribute and really eloquent tribute at the beginning. I really appreciated that. So we live in interesting times. Back in 2016, I just published a book in which I defended this thing I called natural law liberalism, a form of liberalism that I thought is exemplified in the American founding against libertarianism. It was an argument I had with a close friend who's a libertarian, and we were very excited about this book being published, and within months it seemed to have become obsolete. With that election in 2016, it seemed to just suck the air out of both conservatism and libertarianism, and to do strange things. And so it's been a wild ride the last 10 years. I think we all agree about that. What I did not expect is that right after publishing that book, I would have to pivot and start defending the American founding against this new thing called post-liberalism, which I've been doing for the last 10 years. So first it was trying to respond to libertarianism, then I had to swing over and respond to this other group that I think was, if not hostile to the American founding, at least threatening to it. And one thing I will say is that if fusionism exists as more than a pragmatic modus vivendi, if it really is a coherent public philosophy, it's going to be something very like what we find in the principles of the American founding. And that's the thing we should be looking at. Now, I think libertarianism and this new post-liberalism both offer some really valuable insights. But I also think they defend positions that are contrary to the principles of the American founding and even threatening to it. Very simply, post-liberals understand and want to promote human flourishing. They think that's very important. They don't really understand limited government. Libertarians understand limited government, sometimes I think too much, but they don't seem to have the whole flourishing in high regard. And it seems to me that what human beings really want and need is a limited government at the service of human flourishing. They need to see how these are not just two Newtonian masses that have to coexist in some kind of harmony, but they're actually deeply internally, integrally related to one another. And I would love to talk about that more, but I want to address a different thing that I think is more fundamental on this centennial celebration of William F. Buckley Jr. I'll begin with a question. Is William F. Buckley's style of conservatism obsolete? Or to put it differently, can we even imagine a William F. Buckley in today's political culture and climate? So when I wrote my book in 2016, all the parties in the conservative movement, I think, agreed on one thing, that they shared a commitment to civil, reasoned discourse. Conservatives knew that their arguments were better, and that if the contest could take place in the field of reason, we would win. And that's what we were fighting for. For many conservatives today, this commitment seems almost quaint, if not contemptible. Robust public exchanges on firing line, which appealed to the reason of diverse viewers, have been replaced by militancy, vulgarity, and shameless dishonesty. And the appeal really, I think, reinforces and feeds a kind of suspicious and gullible audience in self-siloed consumers. So I'm very worried about the current state of affairs. I am. I think limbic capitalism is bad, but limbic politics is worse. And I'm worried about that. So what's the cause of that decline? Well, clearly we can point to the kind of progressive post-liberalism on the left, woke populism, or woke post-liberalism. But I also think this post-liberalism on the right shares some blame, because I think they both share a kind of affinity for postmodernism. And in a nutshell, postmodernism consists in a replacing truth with power. That's obvious in identity politics, so I won't say anything more about it. But I think there's also a tendency on the post-liberal right in this direction. For example, when Patrick Deneen encourages conservatives to use Machiavellian means for Aristotelian ends, which he says in his most recent book several times. And I wonder, did you read Machiavelli? Are you really recommending Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends? Is that conservative at all? Or when Harvard Law School professor Adrian Vermeule appeals to the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt in his attack against classical liberalism, or claims that political authority should be subordinate to the Pope. Both forms of these post-liberalisms, I think, undermine profoundly civil friendship and the possibility of civic discourse and even the rule of law. So cognitive science and Plato, I think cognitive science actually just confirms what Plato knew, is that reason, like political liberty, is fragile. It's a fragile achievement, and I think public reason is a fragile achievement that was won over centuries of conflict and heroic action, and it always threatens to retreat, and it depends upon some conventions to support it within moral culture, within culture more broadly, within politics. So I want to suggest we need a different kind of fusionism, and I'm calling it soul fusionism, S-O-U-L, as John said, soul fusionism, as a supporting virtue for reason in our culture. That's what we need. So what I think of this is, what if classical fusionism represents these different ordering principles which dispose us to interpret reality in a certain way? And what if those principles are integrally connected to one another, so that they mutually support and reinforce one another? That's kind of what Stephanie was suggesting. But if any of them is divorced from the other, it gets wrenched out of context and becomes a kind of damaging ideology. So I'm thinking of soul fusionism as a kind of quality of character in the soul, which helps us through these ordering principles to see things as they really are. So in practice, what would this mean? Well, within classical fusionism, you might have something like traditionalists, libertarians, and anti-communists, but I'm going to throw another group in there. Pardon, I know I'm going to hear some grumbles on this. I know where I am. Neoconservatism. Okay, each of these groups, I think, has an ordering principle which tracks an important truth. And for traditionalists, it's obviously tradition. For libertarians, it's obviously liberty. For neoconservatives, I think it's something like reasoning about human flourishing. That's what I'm going to say. So you start with traditionalism. Of course, respect for tradition is healthy and important. Tradition embodies all kinds of tacit knowledge that's been gained over time that we could never gain through explicit arguments and ratiocination. And so it profoundly supports a free and flourishing society. But if tradition does not acknowledge liberty or reason, it becomes oppressive and stultifying. Similarly, liberty is valuable. It's the primary means by which human beings achieve their good. It can't be forced on us. And also, other human beings are prone to tyrannize and abuse other people. And so it's important to protect liberty, but liberty needs tradition and human flourishing. Otherwise, it just becomes libertinism. If it's just liberty absolutized, it's not even liberty anymore, I think. I think that's part of the point I'm making. It's not really liberty if it does not have internal to it a respect, an appreciation for tradition and reason. And of course, reason is fundamental to the human good and human flourishing, but without the assistance of liberty and tradition, it just becomes rationalism. And I think rationalism is dangerous. So to repeat, I think soul fusionism is a virtue that brings these into a dynamic equilibrium and helps reason operate well in civil society. And I think no one in the conservative movement exemplified soul fusionism better than William F. Buckley. In all his life and work, one can discern these principles of tradition, liberty, and reason converging deeply within him upon a center that sharpened his perception and his prudence. And I'll hasten to add his magnanimity. That is, his generosity towards truth, even when it was being enunciated by people that he otherwise opposed, his civility towards his adversaries, even when they were wrong. So Buckley knew that the most important thing to know about politics is that politics is not the most important thing. And he also understood, I think, very importantly, that liberty is not the basis of liberalism. Leisure is the basis of liberalism. So in conclusion, the question is not whether a Buckley could exist in contemporary conservatism. For me, it is really whether any conservatism worthy of the name can exist without the soul fusionism of a man like William F. Buckley. Thank you.
Nathan, Acton Institute's publishing a book next year called Why Post-Liberalism Failed. I know where to get a blurb now, so thank you.
Anytime.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, to cheer us up, I give you Charlie Cooke.
I think that we're going to muddle through. That is my position on this. Stephanie thinks we disagree. I think we do a bit. I think we don't a bit. I have always regarded fusionism, as it has been perhaps colloquially used, as being a practical concession more than a coherent ideology. National Review, and this is true now as well, has historically had, what would you call it with the Federal Reserve, a dual mandate. And that dual mandate has been, on the one hand, to promulgate ideas, to make arguments, to take positions. If you look at National Review's editorial line, it is, and has been for a long time, coherent. But also to foster and encourage internal debate. That's true now. It was true when it was founded. And it's fascinating if you go back to when it was founded at how sharp-elbowed those who were engaged in that debate were with one another. It wasn't, I think the tax rate should be 30%, no, I think it should be 33%. It was people who had completely different conceptions of conservatism, of the future. You had people at National Review who believed that they had joined the losing side and that communism was going to prevail. You had people who said they weren't conservatives, that they were on the right. You had the debate between liberty and virtue. And Buckley essentially said all of the above. Now, there are some things that were outside of the remit of National Review. Obviously, this is still the case. You're never going to read an editorial in National Review, for example, calling for communism. You're never going to read an editorial calling for the abolition of the US Constitution. But right from the beginning, there has been a very broad range of views in there. And when I read it in the 1950s and very early 1960s, I get the impression that the people who were taking part in these debates thought they were going to win. In other words, I think that Whittaker Chambers thought he might win the argument. I think Frank Meyer thought he might win the argument. But the thing is, they're all so good that neither of them do. None of them do. And so Buckley's ecumenicalism is, in one sense, a concession to reality. And I think that that is imperative, and I think that it obtains today. So, in a sense, I am an all of the above in this regard. And the reason I'm optimistic is twofold. First off, I think that although there are profound differences at the moment on the right, and Nathan, you mentioned some of them, post-liberalism, for example, being antithetical to much of what I personally prefer, I think there is still a certain glue that holds the right together. The US Constitution, as I argued in a recent speech in Arizona, is an interesting document because it's both conservative and small l liberal in many ways. It's very radical in some senses. It's also very conservative in other senses. What you can say about it, wherever you come down on that debate, is that it is very different than, for example, the documents that were produced by the French at around the same time. Now, of course, I'm originally English, so I have to get some digs at the French in any speech that I give. But the French thought that they would be able to create a new sort of person, a new culture. They tried to recreate the calendar and the clock. Later on, you get the heir to the French Revolution, the Soviet Union, where they want to produce new Soviet man. And the founders in the United States, they don't do that. They have lots of new ideas. They get rid of the monarchy. They create a system in the Constitution that abolishes titles of nobility, and you have no established church, and so on and so forth. But they don't think they're reinventing human nature. In fact, if you run through the debates around the Constitution and you run through the Federalist Papers, you see a deep understanding of history and the presumption that human nature is going to stay the same, that it is not going to change, and that it therefore needs to be worked with. And that's why the Constitution presumes that ambition will counteract ambition. It presumes men will be sinful. The very fact of writing down those rules presumes that people are not angels, as James Madison says. You don't get that in France. And I think the dividing line between those two worldviews, more or less, still animates our politics today and still pushes people onto one side of the line or another. Now, that doesn't mean that people on the right or people within conservatism all agree. But I also think, again, as somebody who is pretty much an unreconstructed Reaganite in his preferences, I also think that we sometimes overstate the extent to which the right was united around a certain set of ideas. If you go back to the 1950s, you will find figures such as Senator Taft of Ohio, whose foreign policy views were completely at odds with the Reaganite consensus of the 1980s. If you go to the early 1990s, you have Pat Buchanan challenging the sitting president of the United States on grounds that now sound relatively Trumpian. These debates have always been there. Now, what was true for quite a long time was that the, let's call it the National Review model, if you will, was the majority. Either it was the actual majority of people on the right, or it won the argument or bullied people into acquiescence. Whatever it was winning. And in recent years, that has changed a little bit. Some of the other strands on the right have come to dominate. But that doesn't mean that they weren't there, and it doesn't mean that they're not conservative, and it doesn't mean that they weren't included within the pages of National Review or within what was considered practical fusionism. I'll accept Stephanie's distinction as intellectual fusionism. There have been periods, too, in recent memory where the vehicle of conservatism, the Republican Party, was not particularly conservative in the way that we would prefer now. Richard Nixon's presidency was, in some senses, one of the most left-wing presidencies in American history, and that was 50 years ago. So I think we often need to be careful not to have assumed that we have won a permanent victory, which, of course, as T.S. Eliot taught us, is impossible. And by the same token, I think we might overstate how dire things are now for traditional conservatism. If you look at this presidency, if you look at this party, if you look at this movement over the last 10 years, there's been some changes, but a lot of what has been achieved would have been recognizable to conservatives at every point over the last, let's say, 70 years, given we're celebrating National Review's 70th anniversary. And on an entirely practical note, I am not yet persuaded that some of the changes that we have seen aren't purely driven by personality and might not change back. I am fascinated, to give a concrete example, by Republican voters' stated views on Ukraine in polling, or stated views on, say, bombing Iran in polling, which seem to do this in a crazy back and forth manner, depending on where the people who influence them are standing. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic about the future of fusionism, because I think that the coalition has always been complicated and messy and malleable. I think that the intellectual side of it has always been far less coherent than some others do. And on the bits that really are ugly, post-liberalism to a degree, some of the anti-Semitism that we've seen creep in, we've been given the blueprint here. This was the one thing that Buckley and National Review did that was genuinely exclusionary. He did not say anything goes. He said, you're not allowed to be in the coalition anymore. And I suspect that if we as conservatives are not capable of doing that, then the voters will do it for us and make it clear that it is imperative that it be done. So as a practical matter, I think that fusionism is still pretty healthy. I've seen no evidence yet to make me depressed. And as a result, I will offer on this panel the optimistic take for the future.
Nice. Is that an unusual position for you?
We have now time for question and answer.
Hello, Colin Axon from Grand Rapids. My question is, if you were to recommend a specific work of William F. Buckley's to a modern audience, whether it be one of his books, one of his editorials, or an episode of Firing Line, what would you recommend and why?
I am not a Buckley scholar, I will say out the door, but I don't know. I look old, I feel old, but I'm definitely second generation in this. So I remember picking up National Review for the first time in 1982. I was 10 years old and flipping through it and being fascinated by the columns that he wrote. I distinctly remember reading, and I don't remember what the context was, I distinctly remember reading Buckley use a Latin phrase, quod licet Jovi non licet bovi. What is right for Jove is not right for a cow. And I thought that is an awesome line. I'm going to memorize that. I'm going to use that sometime in my life. I was just drawn into to the news, and then I remember my father watching Firing Line, and have a distinct memory of seeing with great humor. There was the beat novelist, who am I thinking of, wrote Dharma Bombs and, yeah, Jack Kerouac, and just like smoking away and looked drunk, and Buckley had his tie to like one side, like with his pen, and I just remember thinking this, I wanted to be like this, I wanted to be in this world, but I'm not a scholar. He's more kind of an exemplar to me in his personality, and in the stories about him. Those move me more than his actual writings. Kirk is different. I didn't know anything about Kirk's personality. I just heard a few things, but I loved his writing style and learned a lot from it.
I've been going back and forth in my mind, but about two totally different answers. The first thing that came to mind was he has this strange book. He calls it his spiritual biography called Nearer My God, which is just an interesting and unusual thing. It's not a book in the traditional sense. It's like a scrapbook of his thoughts about different aspects of his Catholic faith. And in some chapters, he just actually just didn't do any writing at all. He just interviewed his closest Catholic friends for their views on things. I mean, it's really, but it's an interesting reflection on his faith, and I think often considered to be one of the more interesting things that he has written. The other thing that comes to mind is his like, again, he like pioneered these genres that didn't exist until Buckley came along. His autobiographies that were like a week in the life of, like Cruising Speed, I think was the first one. And you notice that I'm not naming his political writing. It's like his non-political writing that to me is Buckley at his best.
Well, it definitely wasn't his writing on the Beatles, because he was completely wrong. The Beatles are the greatest band that ever existed, and Buckley hated them. He hated them with a great passion. I would say two things. One is, if you go back to the first ever issue of National Review and you read the statement of intent that Buckley mostly wrote, there was some help. It was a bit like the Declaration of Independence. It was mostly Jefferson, but there's a bit of the others in it. It literally could describe now. I mean, it is just the most universally applicable and prescient piece of writing that could be used to announce a new magazine right at this moment. I think his books are actually quite often, as Stephanie described, I mean, Up From Liberalism is often all over the place as well. So I wouldn't pick those. I think his most entertaining book actually is his book about sailing. And the reason I also think that is important is because, as was mentioned earlier, politics cannot be all-consuming. You have to do politics for a reason. If you start doing politics to do politics, you've forgotten why you're doing politics. You're supposed to do politics so you can create civil society. And Buckley really, really liked sailing. I'm not a sailor, so I found this interesting from an ignorant perspective. But it's really great to see that, because it's another difference between the left and the right in Buckley's estimation, which is that not everything is political, and sailing was not.
This question is mostly for Charlie, but anybody else, of course, welcome to weigh in on it. Someone who's been reading National Review for more than 20 years, enamored quite with Buckley and with Reagan as men of ideas. National Review is a journal of ideas. If, as you say, much of the substance of the last decade or so is recognizable from a very traditional conservative perspective, and I'll agree with that up to a point, why do you think it is that so many other people of ideas in the intellectual space, in the elite space, have been driven in so many different directions by a personality in a way that, you know, even if you look back through history, there's disagreements about Nixon, as was noted earlier, but not quite the reaction to the degree that I think we have seen over the last 10 to 15 years.
You mean, why has everyone gone crazy?
That's a much shorter, more trenchant way of putting it, yes.
No,
brevity is the soul of wit.
They have. It's actually funny you ask this, because this is the subject of my piece in the latest issue of the magazine, which I think is out today, is why did everyone go crazy, and in what ways did they go crazy? I don't know the answer to it. I do think that there's no way of answering it without mentioning Trump as a person who is one of the most interesting and consequential and charismatic people in American political history. And I don't think that's hyperbole. And seems to both be able to drive people who admire him to a fervent sycophancy and people who hate him into sheer frothing lunacy. And we saw this with the White House ballroom, which is one of the silliest stories I've ever seen in my life, but has people saying the Republic's over because they're changing the East Wing of the White House that was built in 1942. So I don't know, but it has been the defining moment. But I think you touched on it because you said, well, it's this man. For whatever reason, Richard Nixon did not inspire that in people, nor did Eisenhower, nor did Gerald Ford, nor did Reagan. There's just something about Trump. But that gives me hope because I don't like the deranging characteristic of it. But he won't be around forever. And I think politics will not go back to normal, but I think it will become a lot more normal than it has been during that period.
Okay. Speaking of the man, I to some extent think of this administration as a Mark Zuckerberg administration in the sense that his motto was move fast and break things. And I'm just wondering if we are doing away with what you might call sclerosis, and then sometime later people are going to have to come and pick up the pieces. I, for one, find the breaking of the sclerosis more refreshing than any damage that might be done.
Is that a question? Okay. Yeah, obviously, disease requires medicine. Bad disease requires hard medicine that could kill you, right? So I'm not going to defend any kind of keep your hands clean politics, perfectly clean and pure. I think that's a mistake. And by the way, I think that's one reason why people have kind of, on the right, have gotten on board with Trump. But besides him just being an entertainer by nature, just a classic American figure. He could walk right out of a Twain novel. But I also think that American conservatives felt so burned so long and lied to for so long that ironically they thought, at least this guy's not going to burn us. Like, he just is what he is. He's cynical, he's hard-hitting, and he can be our fist. And we don't need him to be idealistic because we're kind of tired of the idealistic people. I don't know. But my worry, of course, and I said it way back at the beginning, is lawlessness is a hard thing to. It's fragile, and it's a hard thing to put back to restore when it's been lost. And I'm talking not just about literal lawlessness of speech, lawlessness, lawless in a whole wide domain of realities. When you look around what's going on in the world, I'm horrified by the violent anarchy in other parts of the world and the miserable lives that people live because they've unleashed their passions in pursuit of whatever thing it is. And don't think that can't happen to us. We're human. That line runs through every human heart between good and evil. And so I'm worried that in our lust to get those good results, we may be a little too tolerant. We may be learning a habit of lawlessness, which is not just hard medicine, but other boundaries being broken that should not be broken, and a kind of joy in the breaking that may break us back if we're not really careful. So I don't think it's like a yes-no answer. I think it's play within the framework that you have and use it well, but do it in a way that still respects that domain, that great need for those conventions that help all of us. Because like Thomas More says, right, in the great play A Man for All Seasons, when his son-in-law says, I'd break down every law in England to go after the devil. And then More famously says, and when he turned on you then, where would you go? Like, you imagine Satan just leading him right down to break all the laws to get him. They're like, okay, now you're mine, because nothing's going to stop you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a thing that conservatives have historically understood better than libertarians often, and I come out of the libertarian world, is that things are much easier and faster to break than they are to rebuild. And so you should be very cautious about breaking things because it's easy. You can break it in an instant. It can take centuries to build it in the first place or to rebuild it. A thing that conservatives and libertarians both have tended to understand better than folks on the left have is the importance of keeping in mind the distinction between public and private. That things that are legitimate when done in one sphere, the public sphere or the private sphere by a private actor, is often not legitimate in the other sphere and vice versa. So the state has a monopoly on the use of violence. The state gets to use violence. We don't get to do that to each other, and that's a good thing. And we shouldn't break down that barrier. And conversely, there are things that are much less dangerous when done in the private sector, in the marketplace, for example. When Mark Zuckerberg breaks things, well, nobody's life is really threatened by that, and we can all just go and be on Twitter instead of Facebook or on Instagram, whatever. There are other options because there's a marketplace, because in the private sector, there's no monopoly. The public sector has a monopoly on a lot of things, and so when it breaks, it really hurts a lot of people, and it can be a lot harder to fix. I mean, if the institutions of our liberal democracy are broken, and I think that I'm worried about the direction that we're going on that. I'm not saying that we're already at fascism or something, but I'm worried about the ways in which there's erosion happening all the time, day by day. If that breaks, that affects everybody, and we may not have the resources. It's an unknown whether we have the resources to come back from that when something at that level breaks.
The only thing I would add is that it varies depending on where you are in history and what the status quo is, whether or not the conservatives are conservative or insurgent. And we use this term conservative, but the old line is the day after the revolution, every revolutionary is a conservative because they want to preserve the revolution. There's an interview with Buckley from about 2000 where he says, astonishing line, he says if he were young now, as in 2000, he would probably be a socialist. And the interviewer says, well, you're not a socialist. He said, no, but that would be much more exciting because he thought that he had won. In 2000, a lot of the presumptions of American politics were Reaganite. Newt Gingrich had led that revolution, and they had taken the wind out of the sails of the Clinton administration. And Buckley was bored. You can see it in the interview. What he's thinking is, I really love being a fighter. And he was a fighter. If you go back to the 50s, he was the young upstart. He's talked about in newspaper articles, not as a stuffy conservative with a pipe, but as the guy who's going to break stuff. Well, conservatism, for better or for worse, right now is much more in that mold, because conservatives, I think some of this is true, some of this is not, came to believe that the status quo was so rotten that it needed smashing. And so it's quite difficult to take one set of principles to work out what to do with it, other than the rule of law. And this is where I'm with Stephanie. You've just got to keep the rule of law. You've got to work within that framework, not just because if you don't, others will do terrible things to you, but because that is the core conservative value, I think. So that aside, I think you have to look at conservatism in relation to what it's fighting against. And sometimes it's fighting against a foe that's been vanquished, and sometimes it's fighting against an entrenched institution, and at the moment it's in the latter mode.
When Buckley passed away in 2007, he had one eulogist at his funeral, Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger was probably best characterized as a New World Order type, one world government type. What kind of fusion is that when you compare Kissinger and Buckley?
One of the provocative things I do in my understanding of fusionism, as I define it, is I read foreign policy out of it, right? It's not a three-legged stool where Cold War hawkishness or military adventurism is a constituent component of what it means to be a fusionist. No, it's liberty and virtue. It's those two things. And you can believe in liberty and virtue, and you can be a military non-interventionist. You can believe in liberty and virtue, and you can be a sort of neoconservative, have a neoconservative foreign policy. I think that debate can happen within the fusionist framework, and there are plenty of principled people who come down on both sides of that. And so I am really trying to get people out of the habit of thinking of the sort of especially because the Cold War, I mean, obviously it would make no sense to say you have to be a Cold War hawk to be a fusionist in the year 2025. There's no Cold War. So that, I think, is your foreign policy position is contingent on the circumstances that you face in a given time and place. There's not one set of principles that you have to adopt, I think, for that. And so there can be debates in good faith among fusionists on foreign policy from where I stand.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. We're going to depart the stage here, and I'd like to invite Chuck DeFeo, CEO of National Review and National Review Institute, who's going to close out the evening for us.
Can you hear me okay? Is this on? Okay. Before I begin, let me first just thank everyone who has put this program together, both the team that's done the work to organize all this for us, and everyone who just participated in these panels. So if you could just join me. I have the unenviable task of having to follow them. And if I could answer that gentleman's question earlier, I've been with National Review now about 18 months, worked in the conservative movement my entire career, and it's been a privilege to be a part of National Review. As I've answered some questions, some people's asked me, well, why National Review? The answer for me is if you're Catholic and you're called to the Vatican, you go, and that is what National Review is to me, and I think to many people in this room. And also in these conversations, I've been asked that question. I would recommend actually one it's a collection of Buckley's columns called Athwart History that Roger Kimball put together several years ago. And it's one that I keep referring back to because it reminds me of not only the different areas that he's covered, but just how much fun he was to read. He's covering not only policy but politics in the moment, but so much of what he's done, just as it includes our original mission statement from 1955, as Charlie alluded to, is still relevant today. It's almost speaking to the moment. But that's not in isolation. There's so many columns where there's one of my favorites called Who Killed the Economy that I think any libertarian would enjoy reading who is against crony capitalism. There's so many columns that speak to the political moment about how do you handle the Nixon presidency. While there's a lot of things that the White House is doing wonderfully today, I think it speaks to this moment as well. So I just appreciate not only the 70 years that we've had of National Review, but the 100 years of Buckley's life and the more than 80 to 90 years that we have of his writings. You can find a lot of it collected there. So forgive my rambling for a moment. So there's so much that was covered this evening. There's a lot that I would love to add, but I want to focus my remarks on one question that I have gotten repeatedly in the last 18 months, which was the conservative movement, was Bill Buckley successful in his time? And to me, ultimately, a movement is about societal change, reflecting more a set of beliefs or the change that you believe a group of people need. And in order to affect societal change, you need three things. You need ideas. You need the ability to persuade people to those ideas, and you need a coalition of people who will actually implement them. And so if that is the measurement, how successful was our movement and how successful was the founder of National Review? Well, we'll start. Well, we'll take today. We take for granted that we have excellent institutions like the Acton Institute, like the Kirk, like the Ford Foundation, like the Kirk Center. We have engines of ideas that did not exist in 1955. We have multiple organizations that are putting ideas into exchange and putting these ideas into a way that are actively affecting policy and government at every level. It's these organizations that so effectively make the case for expanding freedom, individual liberty, and for free markets. Just like National Review, these organizations exist to put ideas into exchange. I'm grateful for their work, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with them. We have one, again alluding to Charlie's comments earlier, and it's because these ideas have been popularized in the 20th century, and they're continuing to be popular today. So if we have those ideas, we're moving them into a set of being more popular. Hayek put it best, where if we are to be successful in the struggle for ideas that is underway, we first must know what we believe. That is, so we have to have the ideas, but then we need a group of people to actually to know them at a wider level. No one was more effective at popularizing these ideas than William F. Buckley. As we heard earlier, we went from what was being called in the 1950s of a movement or a set of irritable gestures rather than a movement of ideas. It was Buckley that brought us together. It's through his prolific writing, firing line, and the constant presence across media through the decades that he brought the American people along with us. It's among his abilities was the ability to drive a clear distinction between our vision for society and those of our opponents. In Up From Liberalism, he wrote that modern liberals believe that truths are transitory and empirically determined. Equality is desirable and attainable through the action of state power. And all peoples and societies should strive to organize themselves upon a rationalist and scientific paradigm. That's the left. The conservative alternative, as Buckley framed it, is based on freedom, individuality, the sense of community, the sanctity of the family, and the supremacy of the conscience, the spiritual view of life. That is as compelling a contrast as today as it was when he wrote these words. Lastly, if it's a measurement of three, did he form a coalition of people that could bring these ideas into fruition? Milton Friedman famously said that Buckley's greatest talent was his ability to develop friendships. From the founding of Nash Review with giants like Frank Meyer, Russell Kirk, Whittaker Chambers, Brent Bozell, James Burnham, and countless others, he began and then cultivating policy leaders like Barry Goldwater, his brother James L. Buckley, and Ronald Reagan. He brought us fellow travelers together. And again, when I think about what is fusionism a coalition of people? Is it a means to an end? Or is it a group of people that ultimately have a shared set of principles with just a different area of emphasis? For me, it's the latter. And it's ultimately, that is what holds people together. And then going back to Washington's farewell address, when we think about as he did, a lot of people talked about factions and his warning against factions. What he also talked about was order, or liberty without order leads to tyranny. And ultimately, it's ordered liberty that holds us together, and it's that understanding. I think we heard that from the stage tonight. So my perspective, yes, our movement has been successful. It continues to be successful, and as Charlie said, it is complex. But the best answer to the question of was our movement and was Bill Buckley successful, I think, comes from George Will. As he put it, as he interviewed Buckley at the end of Firing Line, was without Buckley, no National Review. Without National Review, no Goldwater nomination. Without the Goldwater nomination, no conservative takeover of the Republican Party. Without that, no Reagan. Without Reagan, we do not win the Cold War. Thus, Bill Buckley won the Cold War. We won the Cold War but the fight against relativism and central planners, and 4, the philosophy of freedom continues. As the late Ed Follner said, and we, as well as T.S. Eliot, there are no permanent victories, there are no permanent defeats, there are only permanent battles. And that battle continues to wage on, and I do think that we are fellow travelers in this room, and we continue to fight together. And it's with it, and I'm so grateful that all of you joined us tonight. It's with your support that National Review is able to continue this fight. It's how our partners in this evening continue this fight, and I'm very grateful to every single one of you. So I want to give one last special thanks to Gleaves Whitney, to Father Sirico, and to Jeff Nelson for helping, and their teams for putting all of this together. It's been a wonderful evening, and I just thank you for all of us being here together.